He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 28 years of experience. Together, Henry and I are the Brief Brothers. We love talking about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. Henry, we have a fascinating guest today, all the way from London. His name is Uri Baruchin. He is a consulting strategist with a lot of valuable things to say. Let's join the conversation. We have another episode of the Brief Brothers. Today, joining us from London is a friend of a friend. Uri Baruchin is a friend of Baiba Matisone, who lauded Uri in an email and said, "You need to talk to this gentleman." And we reached out, and he's here. So, Uri, consulting strategist with decades of experience, welcome to the Brief Brothers.
Thank you for having me. It's a really great honor. And when I was looking at some of the people that were guests on your YouTube channel, I felt slightly intimidated, but I'll try and step up to the challenge.
We've been able to bamboozle some big names into coming
Yeah.
on.
Yeah.
And Baiba is a friend, but I have to say that before I was her friend, I was her fan. I think she is doing something really special in the strategy space, and that we all can like owe her a thank you.
Absolutely. In fact,
Really.
when I launched my Creative Brief archive, I forget, a year or two ago, collecting examples of great briefs, she has her Creative Brief bank on her, I guess it's her Google Docs page.
Yeah.
And I liberally stole some of the examples that she had, but gave her all due credit, said these are coming from her. So between the two of us, we're trying to provide a service that doesn't exist. So first, Uri, let me say, we're recording this on January 24th, and yesterday was your birthday. So a belated happy birthday.
Okay, thank you.
And I have a question related to that, but we traditionally like to start off by introducing you to our audience and giving you the chance to tell us, how did you find your way into our industry, and a brief trajectory of your career before we start peppering you with some good questions.
It's funny you say my birthday. So I sometimes wonder if the fact that my birthday goes, especially the way Americans say dates, right? It goes 1, 2, 3. And I wonder if that's the reason why I grew up with this expectation for the world to make more sense than it actually naturally does. And maybe that part of my quest as a strategist is trying to bring back sense, but also generally embrace the messiness of overall life. Because I actually think, ironically, a lot of the places where marketing and strategy kind of like falter is when they actually think the world makes more sense than it does, that it's more consistent than it is, that people are more rational than they are. And they start trying to force one dogma over everything. That's where things starts breaking down. Entropy, I guess. That's how it works. Right. So background. So I grew up in Israel, but I have spent most of my adult life in London. In Israel, I was studying for a degree that started philosophy and literature. And then because I found the philosophy bros very hard to stand, it became more and more literature, but specifically more literary theory and semiotics. And I was for a while planning to kind of like do a doctorate. So I was in university for about 6 years or so. But because I grew up on the wrong side of the tracks, almost literally working in fields and consequently trying to escape, I had to work full time for most of my academic years. And at some point, I just realized that the career won over the academic career. And once I left the academic career behind, I also understood that I was never really going to make a very good researcher, because I immediately realized when I was starting to work in a more consulting role, I realized that, you know, when you're in the academy, every time you have a new idea, you get punished by immediately having to reference everything that came before you over like 20 pages. While suddenly I found myself in a discipline where if I have a good idea, I argue for it over, you know, 3 to 5 slides. And if I manage to build something that makes sense, then the client is happy, I'm happy. And there's this magic of a couple of months later, seeing something happening in the world, in the market that follows it. So that was the end of my academic career. But I think some tools that I took from that really influenced how I look at markets and how I look at marketing and how I look at strategy in terms of the importance at looking at things as sign systems and texts and trying to read culture and identify patterns, as well as just discovering that, especially in the communications and advertising side of marketing, a lot of fundamental theoretical ideas, after you kind of like you scrape some layers of marketing, it is actually rooted in communications theory and cultural criticism and cultural theory and even literary theory and how narratives work and how stories work. And I guess I kind of like I came into marketing just as people were starting more and more to talk about storytelling and borrow all sorts of ideas. And I was already back then, even as a junior, I was annoyed by some of the things they were doing because I actually know how complicated that gets and kind of like and what could work for marketing when it comes to storytelling and what we should actually probably ignore and not do. Anyway, so in terms of career trajectory, I found myself in new media, mostly because I was working for a small business that was a bit of a kind of like proto e-commerce business. And then the internet was starting to show up, and then I joined a new media company. And that was a company that kind of like ran the online newspaper website for one of the big newspapers in Israel. And that kind of like then evolved into being a portal company. And if you remember the portal era in the early noughties, we had like any kind of imaginable web genre product. We had news groups, we had dating sites, we had classifieds, we had event guides. And I started in that company as, if I'm honest, almost like a PA to the CEO, because they kind of like cheated me into a role that sounded more fancy than it was. And then I found myself basically being a PA. And after 2 weeks, I said, I was not expecting to be a PA, and I think I'm out of here. But by then, the CEO, and I owe him a lot for that, realized that because I was in the academy, I was actually connected to the internet before commercial internet was available in Israel. So I've been online since 93, right? So I've experienced pre-browser internet. And he said, listen, don't leave. I think you know more about the internet than a lot of the people working here. How about we give you a project? And then I was given a little project, and I was in that company for 3 years, and I left as their director of content development, where I was mostly working in what would today be called product strategy and UX. Back then, not exactly the same title were used, and UX was more called things like information architecture, which today is more distinctive. But while I was working there, at some point, instead of giving me a raise, as a consolation prize, they said, choose a conference anywhere in the world and we'll send you to it. So I chose a conference in San Francisco, which I know in hindsight was the world's first customer experience conference by a company, I don't think they exist anymore, called Good Experience, which were one of the leaders of the early talk about customer experience and things like that. And you know, I went there. I met people who were working for Jacob Nielsen, who to these days is one of like the gurus of usability. And mostly I just fell in love with the idea of taking my career abroad, because I discovered that the things I knew were actually in demand outside Israel. And I visited some American campuses. I visited Stanford, I visited Berkeley, and I thought, you know, I basically came back like Ariel in The Little Mermaid, singing that I want to be a part of this world. But I also realized that with my background, the way I could never afford to study in any of those universities, full scholarship, whatever, I could never afford it. So the only thing that would do it is my career. And I went back to Israel after, so the conference was 3 days, but I added like longer breaks on both sides. And after 14 days in the States, I basically came back to Israel with a Go West flag. And oddly enough, things just fell. It was one of those rare cases, because I don't believe in the law of attraction. That is very, that's bullshit. But it was one of those cases where just because of my intentions, things fell into place. I got an interview with a brand agency that was looking for a role kind of like between information architecture and consulting. And I got an interview with them. They were planning to open an office in Tel Aviv, and last moment decided that the office in Tel Aviv. So I thought, I'm going to work with them for 2 years and then ask to be relocated. And they had a Tel Aviv office and a London office and a New York office. But then they decided that Tel Aviv was only going to be like sales reps, and that people who are actually doing the work, even on the many Israeli clients they had, are going to be based in London. And on my third interview, they suddenly said, how would you feel about being based in London? And I tried answering as coolly as I possibly could, to not give them the feeling that I would do that for any salary and any kind of package. And that's how I found myself in London of a little over, well, it's about 23 years ago now. And that was my first agency. Then that was Siegel and Gale, which is a brand agency that is originally an American. And I was with them for 2.5 years, I think, and then they decided to shut down the London office. I looked for another job very quickly because I was on an employer's visa. I found a job, waited for it for 3 years for 3 months to begin, and they bailed out on me in a very nasty way. And you know, despite myself, I went back to Israel for a little under 2 years, kept freelancing in London with some of the people I worked with in Siegel and Gale. Siegel and Gale then, one of those people then set up his own boutique agency. And the moment he could afford a full-time strategist, he said, I want you to be that strategist. That's how I came back to London again. And this time I was here to stay and never looked back. I was with that boutique agency. It was called Brand Instinct for about 4.5 years. I really liked it there. I did everything because we were so small that we didn't have client services. So essentially, as a strategist, I led strategy for the agency and I led my own clients and, you know, owned the relationship. Something that is very rare for strategists to grow inside advertising, actually. Learned a lot about new business development and client relationships, and actually even kind of like headed the agency with a couple of other people when both of our founders went on maternity leave at some point for a couple of months. But sadly, that agency was badly hit by the credit crunch. So then I freelanced with one agency for a couple of weeks and then found a job at Landor, which is to this day still one of the world's biggest brand agencies. I was with them for about 2 years, a little bit frustrated because I came from a boutique agency and they were a bigger agency. That kind of convinced me to be a senior strategist, even though I was already ready to become strategy director. In order to get that title, I moved to an agency called The Partners. And I stayed there for 6.5 years until I left as head of strategy. The Partners were a very interesting agency, one of the industry's best kept secrets. They were the UK's most award-winning agency for about 18 years straight. They then were made a part as a massive merger that happened in end of 2017, early 2018, because they were a part of WPP, and WPP, as we know, for many years now is constantly kind of like consolidating and making sure it destroys as much equity as it can inside its portfolio. So we were merged with a couple of other brand agencies. And because it was very clear that the whole creative side of the business will go with the Partners, strategy was kind of like handed over to one of the other funding agency. I was trying to find my fit and stay, but it wasn't easy. And eventually I found myself out and starting my own business. I've been independent since. And it's strange because I never planned to like start an agency or be independent. It just happened. And to this day, I often kind of, I miss working as part of a bigger team, and kind of like I hope to maybe still find the right home and the right place for myself. But as long as I'm on my own, I have projects. I work both directly with clients, but also sometimes with agencies. When I work with agencies, it's rarely called freelancing because we tend to write the proposals together. So it's more like I'm a strategy partner to agencies that either don't have their own agency team, a strategy team, or they're slightly smaller. And also being independent gave my time a little more flexibility, which allowed me to develop my side hustle in strategy education, which actually started pretty early in my strategy career. During the time when I went back to Israel, one of the art schools got in touch and said, "Hey, how about you teach our creative people branding?" And I said, I could try. But that actually led later to teaching that at the London College of Communications in London. And that later led to what I've done since I left London College of Communications. Is part of the University of Arts London, which is Europe's biggest art school, essentially. And since then, I've taught both in the School of Communications Arts, and I know you're friends of the school, and you've had students a couple of times. So I led strategy in the school for about 5 years until last year, which, by the way, speaking of briefs, and we should circle back to that, it gives you quite an interesting view of the state of briefs in the industry. But also I teach the DNAD's masterclass in creative strategy. I feel very privileged to do that. I enjoy it very much. I've been doing both those things for about 5 years now. And I guess if strategy in a creative agency specifically tends to be the one who builds that bridge between the client's world and the consumer's world and the creative team, it's even more so for me because I almost have also this side hustle in teaching strategy to creatives. which I really enjoy and I think is super important for our industry. And yeah, so it's interesting because I have one of those career stories that has some non-traditional aspects, but then I just found myself in agencies for 17 years or so, and that is very traditional. And branding, I feel, always attracted me as the more holistic and more, it's kind of like the more holistic and to a degree the more rigorously strategic part of the industry. But I also started in branding early enough when it was still doing a lot of launch campaigns. So I've done advertising. I've taught in the world's #1 advertising school in terms of award-winning students for 5 years. And ever since I've been independent, I've worked with advertising agencies, not just brand agencies. So I'm kind of like this hybrid, start in the digital, went to branding, also do a lot of advertising and comms, also has this deeply nerdy side of being into strategy and bringing it to the rest of the team. And yeah, this is...
You actually fit in quite well. Henry and I have been doing this for 4 years. We've talked to a lot of people in our industry, creative strategists, CEOs, marketers, and almost to a person, the path that they took fits the description of the word circuitous. It's like they didn't start out. I mean, kids today in these programs like the SCA and over here in the States with some of the universities sometimes know what they want in their teens or early 20s.
Yeah, true.
But the people that we've talked to who are in their 40s or older, and Henry and I are examples.
They
We're doing something else.
Stumbled into it, got shanghaied into it.
I kind of got shanghaied into it and just had a knack for it, like I started at Siegel and Gale as an information architect, and 2 weeks in, they said, well, we're going to call you senior information architect. And by the way, we think you're really a consultant. And I was like, really? What, you mean I'm a marketing person? And then I felt very intimidated. And over my 2 years there, read like the full curriculum of an MBA program. And then I told people that I've done it, and they told me, not even people who study for MBAs do that, you weird, nerdy person.
Which is another, I think, common trait, which is kind of getting thrown into situations where you don't feel that you have necessarily the training or expertise and have to make it up as you go along. But because you're smart, you just kind of are able to do it, and people believe it. And we all have, I think, that term imposter syndrome crops up a lot, but I think a lot of strategists,
when people tell me I'm smart, I say that my biggest talent is making people feel like I'm the smartest person in the room rather than actually the smartest person in the room.
For years I denied that I was strategic, and Henry really clued me in that because I ask these pesky questions, it makes me strategic. And I like to say I'm not a strategist, but I play one on Zoom.
But I have to say, I realized I'm a strategist, and I do think I'm a strategist.
But Howard was a copywriter and creative director. But I tell him, there's a spectrum of creatives, and some of them are very good technically, but they're not necessarily strategic thinkers. And then there are some creative directors and creatives that really have a strategic side to them. And I think that those are the ones that we all know by name, like the people like a Bill Bernbach, who I'm sure was a phenomenal copywriter, but beyond that, he had a way of seeing the bigger picture, the consumer, how the brand, how the business lived in the world of consumers, and it was like a proto strategy.
I always feel that the best strategists are creative, and the best creatives are strategic, and that's just the way it is.
Yeah. Well, when I reached out to Baiba to say hello, and she recommended that we talk to you, I wrote back and I said, well, what should I ask? What should I ask Uri? And she said, well, it's his birthday, so ask him. He said, ask him, all these years you've been in the business, what's the one most important thing you would say you've taken away from your experience?
Oh God, she's cruel. That's such a tough question.
Well, I think you're eminently qualified to answer.
Here's the thing. here's the thing, right? On a fundamental level, strategy comes from a very modernist roots. And then
modernist
like
in the literary
marketing,
sense?
modernist roots in the same of kind of like believing in kind of like certain kind of like structures and hidden structures, and that there's a cause and effect relationship between the structures and the hidden structures and then the manifestations. And actually reality is a lot messier, and we know that because we live, you know, in a kind of like within a postmodernity, so to speak. So things are messier. The sad thing is that in our industry, this fact of life that things are actually messier usually translates to, and therefore we are going to be fluffier, and that's not the solution. So even though kind of like frameworks and tools and models
Wait. Uri, define fluffy. What do you mean by
define
fluffy?
fluff. So I think
Is it the same as being silly?
no,
Okay.
this isn't the same of being silly. I think being fluffy strategy is basically
Not rigorous.
the way Rummold defines it, Richard Rummold, in Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, where he says bad strategy is a lack of ideas hidden by fluff. It's basically this kind of like bombastic language and fancy frameworks that tend to distract from the fact that there's no real strategy behind it, right? There are some bugbears that have been with me for this whole career, like things that I was hoping would get better, or things that I thought, oh, it's only because I'm not senior enough, so I don't get enough control, or it's only because I don't know enough. When I know enough, it'll be better. But some of those things have gone with me for my entire career. And one of them is this thing that, for example, and brand strategy is one of the main culprits of this, with our brand onions and fancy brand frameworks, where, you know, so many of those frameworks are those mutated chimera-like monsters that are simply this messy mashup of the fact that the client has already have 3 agencies work on this account. Each agency has its own framework that it has to pretend they came up with, like they've invented the wheel, right? So weirdly, even though I'm as a strategist, when I do actual strategy, I embrace the mess and I know how nuances work and how messy things work. But in terms of the tools I choose and the theory I choose, I'm a slightly neoclassicist, old school loving guy, because I feel I want to clean a lot of our tools from all the snake oil that is obscuring things and making things messy for no reason. And there are so many cases where you look at a framework, right? You look at those, you know, every client wants to define the brand on a single page, right? So they want that framework. You know, I mean, I agree with Feldwick, who's talking a lot. You've interviewed him, right?
Former guest,
Yep.
yes.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. So I agree with Feldwick that the problem with brand frameworks and onions and those kind of things is that they kind of force you in this brand essentialism position that is bad for the brand and bad for strategy and bad for creative and bad all around.
You're talking, for example, about brand archetypes.
Yeah, no, archetypes usually come before the framework, but archetypes tend to be an element in a framework that makes a framework worse rather than better, right? Archetypes at best, they're a tool that helps exploration. I've written long posts that are on my LinkedIn page, on my LinkedIn profile about what's wrong with archetypes. It's not the way markets work, right? It's good to use archetypes if you're exploring the personality of the brand. I will accept that. But we use archetypes for so much more than that. We use them for many things that they can't do, right? It's not the way positioning works. I mean, even positioning doesn't work the way positioning works, right? We know that from people like you know, from the Australian cohort, um, from people like Byron Sharp, we know that positioning doesn't exactly work the way classic positioning or classic marketing positioning, you know, the Al Ries classic marketing positioning was work, especially for big brands. But we also know from people like Ritson who still maintain that relative difference is important and those kind of things. And I agree with that. So I tend to be a neoclassicist in the sense of I tend to try and eliminate all the models that I think this isn't working. This is here because it sells, right? Archetypes are still around because they sell, because they make some research models easier to understand, but those are not good models, right? When you take archetypes and then you impose that on a positioning matrix, it's not the way it's not the way markets work, right?
There's a bias in our industry, and I think we're kind of tiptoeing around it, but there's a bias toward the new and shiny, right?
Yeah, but archetypes have been around for like 40 years now.
Yeah, but as archetypes aside, like all the frameworks that we've seen over the years, like there's people always want to have, and so agencies want to have their own black
Exactly.
box methodology that you're not going to get from anybody else, and it's
And you can trademark
scientifically
it.
it's
Yeah,
scientifically
exactly. Because otherwise it'll be too hard to explain to clients what make one agency different and better than the other.
yeah.
And agencies historically are terrible at explaining themselves. If you look
But
at
it's
you look at
nonsense. It's nonsense. Like athletes don't say that. They simply say,
We
you
do.
know,
We're
what
faster,
makes us
stronger,
different as the
better.
Lakers is that we score more,
We win. Yeah.
right? We win more. That's it. And that's enough. So why is it so hard to just say we get more ideas right than wrong? That's it. That's what sets one agency apart from another. And I think that actually there's so much bullshit out there that actually another thing that can set agencies apart to say, we actually don't buy into any of that shit. We're actually going to deliver the work you need. So going back to my starting point, a lot of time you look at that framework, you know, you look at something that a whole team of smart people, agency side and client side, have spent sometimes, you know what, sometimes 3 months, 3 months discussing on top of a huge research project that came before. And you look at that framework and you can't tell what is the strategy, right? If we borrow, you know, one of the frameworks I do like from Roger Martin, right? He talks about the two questions, right? Where to play and how to win. And you look at that framework and you say, well, maybe I can sort of say what the where to play here is in terms of our audience and the markets we're going for, but I definitely can't tell what the how to win is. Now, it's confusing because there are soft elements of brand strategy that are useful, right? So take, for example, something like brand values or brand attributes. Sometimes those are quite creative, descriptive words, and they are useful if they really focus you. But sometimes they don't do that job. So it works in layer, right? So you have like your business strategy and your
There's
position.
also there's also a lack of discipline when it comes to the clients specifically when it comes to like brand values and brand assets because they want there to be so many, and the more you have,
Yeah.
the less effective they become. When you're one or two things, it's easy to be one or two things. When you're seven or eight
Absolutely.
things, it's hard to be seven or eight
And the
things.
shocking thing is that it's like that for some of the biggest brands in the world. So, you know, I mean, I'm not leaking out anything here because you could actually find brand frameworks from Coca-Cola, maybe not like the most recent versions, but you can find the way their frameworks worked for most of the teams. Okay. And for definitely most of the knots, and
Yeah,
then most of
for a
the
long period of time in a recent period of time.
and yeah, and you look at those things, and an agency can take that and run in any direction it wants because it has so many bombastic words, so many ingredients, so many elements, including some of them that are fundamentally flawed, and then another thing and another thing and another thing. And it mixes things that are actually part of the brief, not part of the strategy, right? They're not part of the how are we going to win. They're part of the background, but they want everything on one page, so they cram everything in. And then I mean, I guess the cardinal sin is do not confuse the strategy with the articulation of the strategy. Now, the articulation is important. I think it's Butterfield who says that the best ideas both direct and inspire. And that is where the pitfall, like between those two things is where the pitfall is. Because people are so insecure about the fact that they need to inspire creative ideas that they start focusing on, okay, let's inspire, let's have some fancy language and bombastic language. But wait a second, you gotta direct.
We talk about that. We talk about that with the specific to the creative brief all the time, which is,
yeah,
my rule of thumb is I would like my creative brief to be clear and inspiring. But if it can only be one of those things, it should be clear, because
absolutely.
that's the challenge.
Absolutely.
Like, that's the challenge. Like, if I come up with something that I think is really good and inspiring, that makes me feel great.
Yeah.
But that's above and beyond.
Now, when you mix those things together, that's when clients get to kind of like the wit's end, right? Because that's where you get those sitting in a room for 30 minutes arguing whether the term in the positioning statement should be modern or contemporary.
Litigating the parsing of words,
and it's
that
not
that
going to
ultimately
influence on
that
any
ultimately
action that
are not
happens
the
in the
strategy.
market.
Yeah.
It's not gonna, if it's not gonna have impact on what happens in the market, then the discussion we're having around what goes in that box of the framework is gravely lacking.
Bob Hoffman.
So I'm this weird mixture, I guess, from being very kind of like fundamentalist, neoclassicist, old school, but actually on a lot of things when it comes to how do we understand research, how do we understand culture, how do we understand consumers, audiences, I then become cutting edge. And as a result, I'm rejected by both the cutting edge people and the old schoolers. And, and this is the story of my pain.
Well, I think it's wonderful, because I think we all would agree, I hope we all agree, that the thing that we often forget is fundamentals. If you go back to the fundamentals, which is, as Henry said, to me, when you say be clear, be absolutely clear, and clarity is the most important part of that. I was just about to talk about Bob Hoffman, who had his new book is called The 3-Word Brief, and one of the things he said, which was a recent post on LinkedIn, is that 90% of what agencies and clients talk about is strategy. But the 10% we don't talk about or feel comfortable with is the creative execution. And when we get into the creative execution, that's when people become tongue-tied, because we don't understand how that magic works. Actually, I shouldn't even call it magic, because there is a kind of a science to it. And if I'm understanding you correctly, Uri, you're saying that it's too much strategy and not enough creative.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have my own, I mean, it's not my own, I have a model that basically tries not to reinvent the wheel, but more like go, this is the wheel and that's how it works. So my model of strategy is a model that has those, and we won't get into it because we'll run out of time, but it has those kind of like, it looks at the different layers in which things work and say, well, there's the market and this is how the market works. And then there's the strategy, and then there's the kind of like the creative, there's the market layer, the marketing layer, and there's the creative layer. And what I personally discovered is that the best news in marketing is that actually the win conditions for marketing tend to be the same win conditions in many situations. And the probably two most famous of those 3 win conditions are relevance and difference. Without going into the whole debate of distinction, differentiation, let's sidestep that. But difference and relevance are always going to play the balancing game, especially with anything that has to do with positioning, right? Like, how much are you relevant to the audience and you tick the boxes of the category conventions, and how much are you going to stand out from the competition? Now, one of the interesting things is that this actually connects on a very fundamental level of what makes the best ideas work, right? The best ideas, and that is, I borrowed that from Smile in the Mind, but also they borrowed that from some theory of humor. There's a reason why so much marketing uses humor, right? A lot of, if you look at some of your favorite ads, you will see that a lot of them, what they do is they have this clever mixture of familiar things and surprising things, which is also how a good joke works, right? Good jokes, they have usually like this familiarity and then this twist that makes you laugh. And that's how a lot of good creative ideas work as well. Now, if you look at that, you realize that familiarity is what tells our brain this is relevant. And surprise is what tells our brain this is different. So actually, what I just did, without going into the full model, is I just showed you how a marketing agenda and a creative agenda are actually the same agenda, just with different perspectives, but it's the same thing. So my experience and the ideas that I've developed throughout my career basically say we are trying to get to the same point here. Let's find some common language. Let's stop confusing each other. Because
So I have a comment and a question, and the comment first is I agree with everything you've said to this point, and I think then the question is why is it the state of a well, that's not the question I want to ask. I'm going to ask in a second, but I think the big question that's posed by what you've said, which I agree with, is why is this the state of affairs? And I think, frankly, it's because we have these large organizations with a lot of people, of which, frankly, most are average thinkers.
simple.
And to have a clear discussion at a high level, there aren't that many people in the client organization or at the agency that are capable of having a high level discussion about these things. And the other thing you said is the common line. When do clients and agencies find the time to get together and define the rules of engagement and this is the way we're going to look at marketing problems, and this is the way we're going to look at advertising problems, and this is what we're going to mean when we say the word insight, and this is what we're going to mean when we say strategy, and everybody has their own definition of all of these things, and we never have a moment to reconcile them.
Right. So what fuels tragedy was known as the tragic flaw, right? And the tragic flaw of marketing comes with the territory. And the territory is simply marketing, 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 right? Marketing is trying to market marketing. Marketing is a discipline. So the beautiful thing about marketing is that marketing is very happy stealing the best ideas from other disciplines. Whatever works. But it starts falling down where the whatever works starts mixing up with whatever sells. And when you get to the whatever sells, that's when I think most agencies have this conflict between should we go with what clients need or should we go with what clients want? Now,
that's ancient. It's
ancient. Short term, the easier thing is to try and give people what they want. But again, as a consultant and someone who grew up in consultancies, I know that you're basically betraying your roles. If you only ever give your client what they want and never kind of push back and give them what they need, you can't call yourself a consultant.
I've seen too many times when a big agency lost its biggest account, not because they weren't giving the client what the client wanted. It was precisely because they were giving the client what they wanted, and what the client wanted honestly amounted to shit over the long span of time, what the client had been asking for and the agency had been delivering was shit. And so they have a review in which new agencies look at it with a fresh perspective, and by the way, have a completely different audience, right? In a pitch, you have a CEO and a CMO that never sat in a meeting with the previous agency to say what was wrong with what the work they were doing, because the work they were doing was a reflection of the employees beneath them that direct the work on a day in day out basis. So
it's getting harder. You know, when I started, we would still be talking to CEOs and CMOs. The CEO would usually be very close to the loop of the brand strategy project. The CMO goes without saying. Nowadays, so many teams, they don't talk to the CMO, they talk to the brand manager. The CMO comes in only in big decision moments because they've just lost interest in what we do, because we haven't been able to be clear enough, to be business focused enough, to show a deep understanding of their business, but also, more importantly, to make that connection. So when we come into those situations and we talk in language that has its place but need to be carefully controlled, like, you know, the language of storytelling, for example, they feel like, yeah, that's, you know, that's not what we do. Being able to kind of like cut through the layers and show how those things actually dance this close dance together, I think that's where the real magic happens.
Yeah, you know, Uri, we kind of have to have a kind of a hard stop here because we have to move on, and we haven't even touched on some of the topics that I know we'd love to talk about: briefs, the get to buy, and your thoughts on, you know, your further thoughts on, you know, I loved your article about how did marketing break brand archetypes. I'd like to dive into more of that.
Right.
I would love to have you come back if we could arrange that and continue this conversation.
Hopefully.
Because you've opened up so many cans of worms, and there's so much to unpack that we just haven't been able to dive into.
That's my curse. I will tell you.
No, it's a blessing. That's what we do.
I'm going to blame Baiba because she was the one that asked the massive, like, big, like, existential question as the first question, Howard.
Okay, well.
I mean,
I think it was a great question.
Going in circles too much, but listen. So when I was at the School of Communication Arts, the interesting thing about SCA is that we simulate the agency environment, right?
Yes.
So the sponsors of the school send briefs constantly. Now, I don't think many people in the industry are in a position where they see dozens of briefs every year from different agencies in different industry disciplines. And I was in that position, and I was looking at those briefs, and I can say now, because I no longer need to be polite to our sponsors because I'm no longer at that school, but the average standard of briefing in this industry is appalling. I don't need to tell that to you guys, right? That's been your crusade. It's appalling. And actually, in the case of the UK, there's one framework that is the culprit for most of the briefs breaking down.
And which is that one?
Is that the get to buy?
That is the get to buy. And
yeah, and the sad thing though is that the students aren't grounded enough in what makes a good brief to push back. They have to work with what they're given. And they really should be grounded in, this is what a good brief is. This is how you get there.
Not just the students, the people that are working on this professionally are getting.
Well, no.
briefs.
I'm saying in the context of the SCA, they get these briefs, but they don't have the vocabulary to push back, or the experience, or the chutzpah.
We teach them that. They get that. But the interesting thing is that framework is not a bad framework. It's just that almost no one remembers the actual framework and how that framework works and where it comes from and how it was invented and how it was defined. And that's why we need kind of like amateur archaeologists like Baiba to kind of like dig back and give that is something that Feldwick and Matisone have in common. They serve as the guardians of the memory for an industry that is amnesiac.
Absolutely. See, this is something else we could talk about. So Uri, I wish we could keep going, but we have to stop now, but we're going to have you back to continue this conversation. Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach. Together, we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time, bye-bye.